I was lucky enough to meet Steve and see some of his programs last summer, and it's truly a pleasure to have Steve here, one of the pioneers in crisis residential services, who's going to share about some of his experiences and what's been good about how he's been able to partner with his community to build a number of crisis residential services in the San Francisco area. So please help me in welcoming Steve Fields.
I think I might, yeah, yes I am. Hello everybody, good morning. I will now play a Nirvana. A lot of music of people who should have been institutionalized but weren't. Inspired me in my career. So anyway, it's great to be in San Diego because in my career, actually, Travis just lopped 20 years off of my time at Progress Foundation, so I feel a lot younger this morning than I was when I woke up. I actually started working at Progress Foundation in July of 1969 as the first counselor in a halfway house. That's what they were called back then, if they existed at all. In the midst of the deinstitutionalization effort of California, which has been, I'm proud to say, in the forefront of deinstitutionalization for over 45 years, and they've screwed up almost every phase of it. But at least they've been trying, and it's amazing how many states still haven't made that commitment to actually move out of institutional treatment in one form or another for people who are labeled severely mentally ill. I came to work so you can understand my perspective. I came to this work as a political activist. I grew up in a Communist Party family. We were labor activists, we were civil rights activists. I was planning to refuse induction in the draft, the Vietnam War one that Travis referred to back in the old days. I would have liked to have met his grandmother at my draft board because I didn't have anybody that friendly to me. So I went to graduate school at UC Berkeley in English literature. And I wanted to get a year of grad school in before I went into prison, because I figured coming out of prison with a felony record, at least if I had a year of English graduate school, I was going to be employed. Turned out it was the best decision I ever made to apply for a conscientious objector status as an alternative. And I should not have been granted that status, coming from a family that didn't believe in any religious activity at all, but nonetheless, out of strange events, I was granted the CO status. And I had to look for alternative service, which is what we did back then for a conscientious objector. You're supposed to do 2 years of service in the community somehow. And that's why I landed at Progress House. It had just opened a door, it had no staff. It was trying to figure out a way to deal in the city of San Francisco with this new influx of challenges based on closing the doors of Napa State Hospital. And they were looking for someone who would work for free. I was eminently qualified in that category. Went back and told my wife, well, you know, I've been costing us money at graduate school. At least now I won't be paying tuition. I'll just be going to work 60 hours a week in this house up on a hill in San Francisco, trying to figure out, as Travis said earlier, what the hell am I doing here? I started working in the field expecting to just do it for a while and leave. Because I was arrogant enough to believe that I could learn anything, I decided that if I'm now going to sit in this house with 6 individuals who had an aggregate probably of about 90 years of mental health treatment among them, and they were in their early 30s, I'd read books and I'd talk to people and I'd get ahead of the curve. And so I started studying the field of mental health as it was expressed back then. And I started talking to the psychiatrist who was one of the founding people of Progress Foundation. I don't know why they called it that. It's an aspirational name, I guess. And I had an epiphany early in my stay, sitting in this house, talking with these 5, 6 individuals about their history, their lives, and who they were, which was I had this moment of self-preservation where I realized that as long as I thought I could know more about them than they know about themselves by reading and studying what was supposed to be their diagnosis or their pathology or what was wrong with them, that I was never going to connect with any of them. That at some point I would be approaching any relationship with these individuals based on their disability, their diagnosis, and what I think I had learned about what was going to help them. And I gave up trying to get ahead of the curve by reading. Helped it when I started meeting with the psychiatrist and tried to match what she was telling me I should do back in the house when I came up with problems of 6 people living together and struggling to survive in a community setting with all of the stresses that they had. Her advice was worth almost nothing. Every time I tried it, it didn't work. So I figured I'm going to have to forge a new idea of what the relationship is between me and these people in this house at this moment that allowed us both to bring something to the equation. And in some way, it was that experience at Progress House that still informs everything we've done in Progress Foundation since that time, at least when we're at our best. Sometimes we drift from it and we don't stay there. But when we're at our best, I'm a proponent of the idea that we have over-professionalized the whole field of mental illness and mental health treatment and behavioral health. We've confused the discipline of psychiatry with the social issues that drive people into mental health systems. San Francisco has an African American population that now is under 4%. Gentrification, everything else is driving our diversity out of our county, one of our main strengths. But the number of African American men who are in the psychiatric emergency room is 5 times that amount. You can't convince me that we're talking about a brain disease when we're looking at the social consequences of trauma and violence and drug use in the community and growing up in neighborhoods where you didn't feel safe. I saw that early on in my work in San Francisco, and I said, diagnosis doesn't tell me anything about what I need to try to do to reach people and help them get out of this dilemma. Medications are a tool in a small, limited way, but when they get in the way of communication, when they get in the way of listening to what people are saying about their hopes, their plans, their dreams, then it's actually a negative effect. And I had the great opportunity in '69. I mean, things were kind of, this is the cool part. I'll put on my sunglasses. San Francisco was really an interesting place in 1968, 69, 70. And I had a chance to hear about Soteria House. And I was looking for allies and looking for approaches to doing the work that I was trying to learn that would help me understand a broader idea of working with this idea of disaffection. I'd read R.D. Laing, I'd read The Divided Self. I was intrigued with the idea. I was planning to go to Kingsley Hall and visit it and see it. And then right in my own neighborhood in Santa Clara County in San Jose, Soteria House happened. So I went down there to see what it was about. And it to use '69 terminology, it blew my mind. I'm in a house that was dynamic, it was dangerous in terms of things were happening all the time. It was staffed with a coming and going of volunteers and people were there. I met a man named Boyce Hendricks who I remained in a relationship as a friend for the next 15 years. And everything they said about the theoretical model of Soteria House excited me. And I didn't get to know Loren Mosier then. I got to meet Loren later in the '70s when he realized that Progress was trying to do an acute alternative to hospitalization in San Francisco. And we connected at a conference. I don't even remember where it was. But the closest thing to a mentor in a way I've had in my career was Loren. He could be prickly, he could be a pain in the butt, but he was confrontational, he was involved, and he was this psychiatrist who was as much a pain in the butt to his own field as he was to anybody else. And Lauren and I kind of connected around this sort of mission of trying to carry a different idea into the mental health system. So why did we need one? You know, historical context is important to me. I think mental health systems have two things, generally speaking. I'm labeling now, I'm diagnosing. They are ahistorical and they are risk averse. And if you're ahistorical and you're risk averse, it's going to be a heavy lift to find policy people who even understand what the point is of doing crisis residential treatment, except as just a mechanical implementation option for a system of care. I'm amazed to this day how mental health systems do not teach history. It's almost like it's the point of coming in like that movie Memento, where the guy had to tattoo himself to remember what happened yesterday. I've done 50 years. I've gone through 4 generations of mental health leadership in San Francisco. And each new generation is never imbued with the idea of how did we get here from there. I'm starting all over with everybody, almost all the time. This idea Travis mentioned of, you know, when he took over the position, he was looking for where are the notes to help me figure out what I'm doing here. Well, in some way, the mental health system is so episodic and so confused, I would suggest, about what it's trying to achieve, that it doesn't leave a trail about what did we do that didn't work 20 years ago, what might work now if these conditions change. They just keep trying the same thing over and over because it sounds like a good idea to someone who just came out of graduate school. And then we in the community have to put up with this kind of educational opportunity. But the risk-averse part of it is even more damaging. It's really hard to do the kind of program that I'm describing this morning and that represent a lot of the crisis residential programs that I've been reading about in the handbook, which, by the way, is a great contribution. Travis and TBT, to be determined, TBD, that's the only way I can remember, done a great service in starting to pull this thing together. And it's why I wanted to be here. I was energized by Travis's visit. But we keep starting anew every time. So let me say a couple of words, because I've been here in the history of the development of community mental health in California, but looking at it nationally for a long time. Like a lot of movements, community mental health came out of a political motivation, a financial motivation. There were all kinds of forces at play where those states wanted to get out from under the burden of state hospital care because Medicaid was now offering an enormous new funding stream for the community. There was a chance to take advantage of the Community Mental Health Centers Act, which took a while to get going. If you look at the implementation of what we call community mental health in this country, it did not have an underpinning ethic of principles and practices that distinguished it from the institutional system it was supposed to be replacing. And I defy anyone to go back and look for that statement of what is the ethic, what is the practice that follows on that ethic, what is the goal of a community mental health system that allowed it to decide its own kinds of services, its own way of developing the balance between institutional care and community care. You can't find it. I had in my youth an opportunity to serve on a task panel of the Jimmy Carter Presidential Commission on Mental Health, the first one since the Kennedy Commission that produced other reforms. And it was only because of an organization I was involved with, CASRA, that we kind of bullied our way into that process, because believe me, a college dropout with no mental health background should not have been involved in those discussions. But they made the mistake of coming to San Francisco, and we offered testimony that was the beginning of this critique of the mental health system. And this is an interesting telling point. The Presidential Commission had probably 80 task panels providing input going up to the full commission. There were task panels on everything you could imagine, by demographic, by height, by weight, by ethnicity, by rurality. Well, that's a new word. But they added at the last minute, as a result of going around the country, a task panel that was called Serving the Chronically Mentally Ill and Long-Term Care. It was an afterthought of the Presidential Commission in the mid-70s to add a task panel that would look at the very core of the challenge of our mental health system coming out of this presumed deinstitutionalization effort. So I got on that task panel, and I showed up at a meeting. The only thing that was cool about it is Rosalind Carter was sitting in on ours, and she's one of my heroes. Rosalind Carter was fantastic. But I was in a room of everybody who almost always would ask what my credentials were before they would listen to what I had to say. So I just got more obnoxious as a result. But in reading the material that went, I was looking for stuff that formed the underpinning of what we were supposed to be talking about. The fundamental idea of the development of the community mental health system in this country was an unbundling of the state hospital. It was not a set of new goals and aspirations. It was the unbundling of a set of services. Well, we had inpatient stuff, we had doctors, we had day program, we had medications, we had all this stuff in the hospital. So what they did is they took these things, unbundled them, and then distributed them around the communities with an amazing amount of arrogance. Because they forgot something fundamental when they did that. There was a woman named Leona Bachrach who was seen as a leading thinker in the deinstitutionalization process. And that was specifically Leona's prescription. Unbundle the state hospital and provide these things in the community. Forget for a while, what they forgot was when individuals were in the state hospital, they didn't have a lot of choice about what they were going to participate in the way of treatment. They were there. And if they didn't want to go to the day program, someone found them and brought them to the day program. If they didn't want to take their medications, believe me, they took their medication. What they didn't see was, by providing the most important tool to our consumers of mental health services, they now had a different game they had to play, which was choice suddenly came into the equation. Somebody living in the community had to see the value of going to that day program that was boring and condescending, or taking medications that were causing them to actually not be able to feel that they had any energy or any life at all, from a doctor who wouldn't listen to them when they said, "This stuff makes me feel terrible." So instead of saying, "Oops, we have a problem now, we've got to find a way to kind of sell our product because participation in the treatment is important and we can't use coercion anymore. What are we going to do?" Instead of that, and you can see this in the developing literature, what our field did, and if you read the journals, you all know, do you read journals? I had to for this thing. But you know, acronyms are the charge of the day, right? Because you can only have so many words, so you have to keep coming up with acronyms. I keep seeing this thing appearing in journals, two fundamental underpinnings, finally, of community mental health. It was all about the pathology of the clients and the patients. Not coming for services was now called treatment resistance. And it was part of the way you could tell you were dealing with a mentally ill person. They were resistant to the thing that we knew was best for them, including their medications, including these day. Forget that a lot of the day programs were in parts of town that no woman who is sane would want to go. So they stopped going because it was dangerous. That wasn't a factor. Another person might be considered, yeah, you have a point there, but if you're mentally ill, it became part of the spectrum of your pathology. And the other thing was the most interesting one. Pretty soon you started seeing articles about treating yaks in a day treatment program, YAC. Yaks and medication compliance. Do you know what YAC stood for?
No.
Young Adult Chronic. Now, my time in English graduate school taught me to look at language. You can't be young and chronic at the same time. That was not a diagnosis, it was a prognosis. It betrayed what our treatment system thought of the people we were treating. And it translated into the way they thought about what should be available to individuals seeking help in the community. And it sounds like an overstatement, but if you look at the pattern of service delivery, that's exactly what turned out to be true. Housing, which if you asked any consumer from the point they hit the city from the state hospitals until now, any consumer of services would say they want a place to live that's decent and safe. If you ask a lot of them in their more cogent moments, they'd say, I want a job. Housing and vocational services are still the lag leaders in developing our community mental health system. 40 years later, and we still presume to make judgments about who needs to be in a hospital by offering nothing else that might A, divert them from that outcome, or help them not get back to that position once they move back into the community. Medicaid, inpatient, outpatient, day treatment, that was their progressive model. I was told in those days, yeah, normal people go to college and live at home. And we want to replicate that for our patients so they get to go to day treatment as a kind of going to college thing. And they'll live in boarding homes and inadequate environment. Where they lived and interacted 22 hours of the day was less important than that 2 hours in a day treatment program. Or their 50 minutes taking blood turned into a 20-minute med. Community Mental Health Centers Act didn't add residential services to their array until 1976, which is why La Posada happened. I leaped on an opportunity to use the Community Mental Health Center, finally understanding that something other than hospital care made some sense, and wrote a proposal in San Francisco to put together a continuum of care, crisis residential, a transitional residential treatment program, and a series of 3 apartments in the Mission community to take advantage of this. And we got the funding. Everyone thought we were crazy to do La Posada because we were doing it in a house in the community. I thought we might have been crazy, but I was kind of looking for a way out. If this didn't work, then I didn't want to do this anymore. But the motivation behind La Posada for Progress Foundation and for me was the inspiration of Soteria. I wanted to find a way to put the values of not adding this exogenous, overwhelming chemical straitjacket on everybody, and then trying to determine what their willingness, their capacity, and their involvement in would be in taking charge of their own recovery and their own rehabilitation. The medications pretty much is the first thing you'll see in any brochure from an institutional setting in 2018. What's your treatment? They lock people up, and then they highlight the fact we do psychopharmacological interventions. So you got them locked up. It seemed to me, I was naive back then, that's to take me out to be able to take the meds away and find out what's really under all of this, not add more. They were kind of, from my point of view, those institutions were bankrupt in terms of ideas. And I wanted to try something like Soteria. So I thought, okay, you don't remember that? Do you guys ever watch I Love Lucy? Used to be, I'd do this with my new counseling staff as they were younger and younger, and they'd look at me like, what the hell are you talking about? I love Lucy. And since cable, they all watch this stuff now. I used to say the only thing I knew about mental health when I came into working at Progress House, I learned from Hawaii Five-0. And nobody knew that till now. Which was about once a year, Hawaii Five-0 would have a program where a psychotic person would go up on the top of a hotel and start shooting tourists. And that was the equation with mental illness. We haven't advanced much beyond today, I'll tell you, in terms of how the public is informed about what the real issues are around mental illness. So I Love Lucy had this great episode where Ethel and Lucy are working in a cake factory. And they're at a conveyor belt that's coming through this unseen flat door. And the cakes come along, their job is to spray whipped cream on it, put a cherry on top, put it in a box. And they're talking, whipped cream, cherry, box, whipped cream, cherry. And then this belt starts speeding up. And suddenly, they can't adjust to the speed. And they're falling apart. The whipped cream's going on Ethel instead of on the cake. The cherries fall, and then they're all falling out of the box. And to me, that looked like a metaphor for the community mental health system. Once we got out of the classic deinstitutionalization phase, which was a lot of people who had been long-term residents and had been turned into people who were living in an institutional mindset. And the second phase of deinstitutionalization in any state that's tried it, which was the one the policy people should have been thinking of. It wasn't the people we were pushing out of the state hospital that we'd already destroyed in many respects. It was the younger people who weren't going back in the same way. They weren't going in for 20 years. They weren't going in for 25 years. They were revolving in and out of this institutional environment with a whole new set of ideas about who they are, what they deserved, maybe they weren't conscious of it, and how they were going to behave in the community. That's when the belt speeded up. We had a system that had relied on an old paradigm of what mental health treatment was, based on a mistaken assumption that involuntary care and the lack of any choice proved how good our services were. And then people suddenly started voting with their feet in the community. So, if you think a 22-year-old is a young adult chronic, are you going to open a rehabilitation program? Are you going to invest in vocational services? Are you going to work with them about getting back at stages into full participation in their communities? No. You're going to open boarding homes. You're going to fill them with medications. And then 25 years later, when that client is still in that boarding home, we will congratulate ourselves on our clinical perspicacity. We knew Fred was chronic because we knew it when he was 22, and he's still in this boarding home. So, not understanding that history of how we got to where we are created a situation in San Francisco where we were just overbedded on inpatient treatment. Travis alluded to this. We built our systems from the top down. This is a cliche, but when you look at it, it's true. Medicaid funded it that way, Community Mental Health Centers Act funded that way. The thing that the people with no imagination and who are risk averse were encouraged to open were inpatient beds. And then we started spending down to inpatient, to day treatment, to outpatient, and then we ran out of money. And when we ran out of money, people didn't get services they need, so they showed back up in the emergency room, and then they said, we need more inpatient beds, because look at all the people showing up in the emergency room. It sounds simplistic, but I'm a complex political actor. I'm just telling you, some things you just gotta call out, If you lie every time you open your mouth about anything, you're a liar. And there may be complexity involved in that. I'm just drawing that from the air somewhere. So sometimes political action requires accepting the simplicity of it all, because sometimes the solution isn't complex. The solution is, you're doing it wrong. You need to look at a different way of doing business. And we are still struggling in the United States with this idea that money comes from the most acute setting, when you show up acute, down to community services, without a belief that if we had invested in community interventions that aren't even interventions yet, that just give people the fundamental things we all take for granted that help support us when we're stressed, help us deal with problems when we lose our job and we're out of money, that deal with trauma and racism and economic inequality in our communities. If we had said that creates the phenomenon that we then see as mental illness. Yeah, there's behavior that's diagnosable, but if we don't go deeper than that, we're not serving anybody, unless we're actively trying to change that. So in a way, what Progress Foundation has been involved in, as long as I've been there, is a social change agenda, not a clinical one. Whenever I get a chance to talk to anybody about what we do, I never mention that we're a mental health program or behavioral health program. I mention that we are a social change agency that's working in the field of behavioral health with an enormous amount of parallels to education interventions, to dealing with children and youth in a different way. We needed a voice, and we needed examples of what it looks like when your motivation isn't guided by the narrowness of pathology or brain disease or diagnosis, but understands if we don't go deeper than that, we're going to continually have the problem. And we can't say that's not our problem, that's an education system problem. That's not our problem, that's housing. We don't do housing, we do treatment. Well, housing is treatment. It's treatment just as a house. But when you add staff to it in a house, it's even better treatment. And it's that message that I have to say I had a chance to carry to a very progressive jurisdiction called San Francisco. Progressive mainly on the level that if you were willing to do something wacky and you took responsibility for whether it worked or not, they were with you on that. And they weren't going to be there to back you up when it all went wrong. So the Ethel Lucy thing caused me to say, okay, I'm tired of running a house that's sitting in the cake factory waiting for the people to be produced, that now I had to struggle to try and help them find some hope, some energy, some belief in themselves. They'd already come in with this mindset about themselves that we had to strip away. It was this exogenous kind of, like you have a beautiful house and you buy a new house and you see the wallpaper or the painting going on, and you strip the paint, you see there's beautiful woodwork underneath it. We were putting lacquer on top of people and then defining them by things like lack of motivation, all the terms we use, which I don't allow, acting like I have any power in my own agency. If I'm there, I stop staff meetings when someone will start to introduce a new client who may have just moved in and said, well, Mary is a paranoid schizophrenic, and I stopped the meeting and say, no, she's not. This is 1970, because I didn't know any better. I said, no, she's not. That doesn't tell me anything. Tell me how she got here. Tell me what her story is. Tell me what she's telling you. But as soon as you start talking back to her the way every mental health program has ever talked to her, she's not going to get angry. She's not going to get violent. She's going to shut down. And as soon as she shuts down, you've lost all hope of connection. And she's going to do it fast if you don't earn her trust and earn her credibility. And when she shuts down, you'll go on acting like a counselor. She'll go on acting like a mental patient. She'll tell you, gee, that's the best thing I ever heard. Even though she's heard it 50 times in her life because she doesn't want to hurt your feelings. She'll go through the motions and get discharged, and everyone will think, hey, we had success with Mary. But nothing, no connection happened. So the goal of this thing was to find some way for us to open a crisis program. I was calling it crisis residential, trying to do a Soteria model in the public system. All our funding at Progress Foundation comes from the County of San Francisco as a conduit of Medi-Cal, state funding, and local funding. I basically, there's this old story. You know Willie Sutton, the bank robber from the 30s? Anyone? He's not on cable, so you don't have to. But he will be. There'll be a 6-part series on Netflix pretty soon about Willie Sutton. Well, Willie was one of those, that era of the hero criminal, that we seem to think was through Bonnie and Clyde. He was a bank robber, and a very successful one. He kept getting put in jail, he kept breaking out and robbing more banks. One time, as the legend has it, there's no film of this, no YouTube, he was being led into jail, and a reporter yelled out to him, "Willie, why do you rob banks?" And he said, "That's where the money is." Clarity like that is rarely available to us in our life. So one of the things that I knew that I was going to be able to sell La Posada on, which was our first crisis residential, was to directly attack the front door to the hospital, saying, if you don't have a 24-hour alternative in your community that can take people any time of the day, that is staffed well enough to deal with behavior that still represents someone in a psychiatric crisis, then you are hospitalizing people who don't need to be there. That's a fact of life. That's like a law of thermodynamics. That's physics. That's not politics. That's just the truth. But communities that have very limited or not very aggressive alternatives to their hospital beds will always fill their hospital beds because those people look like they need the hospital because it's a subjective judgment. And it has to do with the risk-averse nature of the people working in the emergency room, the lack of a real outlet where you trust this person will get good, intensive care in a different environment. And so that's what happens. And so I wanted La Posada not to fail. So when we opened it, I went to the county and I said, we will only take referrals that come from your psychiatric inpatient assessment center at San Francisco General Hospital. We had the advantage of it being all around one place. So I said, the way you get into the hospital is the way you'll get into La Posada. And they need to send us anybody they think we could work with, and we will accept any referral they send us. I'd seen colleagues always have a list of who they won't work with. Can't work with this, can't work with that. Fire setters, like that's, like there's Presbyterians and there's fire setters. We won't work with fire setters, never looking at context or how long ago it happened or what might have gone on, anyone violent. So I just said to here, I can't appear, it's bad enough to ask them to send somebody to a house in the community. I gotta say no exclusions, because I knew they were gonna be more conservative than we were. They were going to be afraid to send us people. So why give them a cudgel to hit us over the head with right from the start? Turned out to be true. They didn't have any idea how to use this. But the miracle of La Posada when it opened was that district of San Francisco's emergency assessment and triage and doorway into the hospital was not at San Francisco General. It was in La Posada. When we opened the program on the first floor, it was the county triage team. The police cars drove up to this building. And I knew that logistics were going to work in our favor. If they wanted to hospitalize somebody, they had to get them 5 blocks across town for a change. Most CSUs are in hospitals, the ones that, or they, after 23 hours, send someone to the hospital because they haven't cleared yet and they have nowhere else to send them. And in San Francisco, the way into the inpatient unit was through the emergency room. So we had this advantage of putting that triage. So they had it was in their interest to refer into La Posada. So they say things like, well, let's send them upstairs and see what's going to happen. And that's the first thing that taught me how subjective the decision is about who needs to be in the hospital. Because when the individuals who were brought in a police car, kicking the windows, would go upstairs, they saw a house. They saw a familiar environment. They saw other clients wearing their clothes, for instance. They saw 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week Spanish-speaking staff. This was the Mission District, right from the start. Because I didn't need licensed credentialed people. I needed people who knew how to work with people in distress. So we opened it right away, 24/7. So if they tested us with Spanish, there was someone there who could talk to them. And most of the people said, I'll stay here, but I won't go to the hospital voluntarily. So if you want to hospitalize me, it's going to have to be a 5150, which is the California. But I'll stay here. And we got a shot at working with clients. It may have taken 6 months or longer to even get the referrals we wanted if we'd been removed. It was a serendipitous outcome of being in that environment that allowed La Posada to happen. So then the goal was, and for me, because I was becoming more practical, I knew it wasn't going to be worth much to do an acute, they were now calling it an acute diversion unit. Well, this is by Counties Institute. They want to call it a YAC. And so, in a practical way, I wanted it to succeed, and that's what retrospectively caused me to look at our experience in the cake factory, where I knew that we could do more. I knew that we had, I mean, you know, in halfway houses and residential, and it's maybe true in some of your experiences now. If you looked at a given residential setting and you just tried to figure out that, in our case, the psychopathology on an average Muni bus was greater than it was in these programs because of the screening that would go on. You know, you basically had to prove you were mentally ill to get in, but if you acted like you were mentally ill, they kicked you out. It was just, there may be something there around treatment. It may be like an instantaneous expectation on. And that was true in the 70s about a lot of the programs in San Francisco. So I think to say, you know, to this day, just to sort of be provocative with my staff, I say, I don't think you should do any intakes. You need to know a few things for liability. But, you know, clients who are veterans in the system tell you everything you want to know. They know how to game you, they get in, and then they decide they're not going to do it, so you've got the same challenge. How do you work with somebody getting involved in participating in their own treatment? And the one that's staring at the floor who's mute and unable to answer is maybe the very person that will blossom in your program. You can't make a judgment that accurately about what someone's capable of till you give them an opportunity that tests their capacity with full supportive backup. So stop doing intakes, just take everybody. You know, find out if they just murdered a small town in Fred, you know. and tell me why you still think they should get in, and I'll back you up when the San Francisco Chronicle calls me. But I haven't gotten that far. But what we do are first introductions to a program that are based on the person's story. It's not an intake. It's a welcome. And that's a soft, goofy word, but it's true. Each one has to be different. Each one has to follow the flow of the person coming into the program. You want them to talk to you, or you can't do anything effective. I always kind of thought mental health treatment was based on communication. It's a social and relational thing. And when I saw the psychiatry profession moving toward just medicating and not talking, because as I was told, these people, meaning the YACs and the chronic, aren't amenable to talk therapy. Yeah, you know, on Thursday at 3 o'clock, taking 3 buses to get to your office, who they barely know you and trust you, they're going to like open up to you, I'm sure, when in fact the consequence may be they get hospitalized for what they tell you. No, that's kind of a bad model for both the client and you. So why don't you guys go work with someone else, and we'll deal with the traumatized clients that are showing up in the emergency room, because I think it's a more complicated issue than that. And so I look back and say, well, what are the things about our transitional program, our halfway house, that had evolved in its willingness to work with complicated, challenging clinical issues that I can't afford to compromise if I'm going to take the risk of opening a crisis residential? They came up with what, in retrospect, I regret, but nonetheless, categorization of things is important. And I have these in more detail in this toolkit thing that NIMH or CMS within SAMHSA funded, which is sort of a model of soup to nuts. It's also got a great chapter, by the way, on the research Travis alluded to. It's incredible how long the research has supported alternatives to hospitalization. It goes all the way back to the 70s, and it continues into. But Warren Mosier's most pressing article that he actually wrote in the 80s was, when all the data shows that these programs are better, why aren't there more of them? That's what we're always talking about in this, is politics. It's not about prove you work. What inpatient unit has ever had to prove that it works? Where's the outcome studies on inpatient treatment? There aren't any. But we in the community keep struggling with this burden. We're supposed to prove we do something that an $800,000 a day program can't do. But they're not held accountable because they're just the processing. So I thought, well, let's figure out what are the things that would make an acute diversion program successful. I came up with 5 of them. Normalizing environment, almost always aggregated. I have visited crisis programs that are in environments that have no corollary to the experience of the client in their life. They are not normalizing, they're not houses really, they're institutional adapted centers. And I'm a profound believer that the last thing I would ever get rid of in what we do, and believe me now, we've served 28,000 clients in acute diversion in 4 different programs. They're all, one of them is unique, but 3 of them are houses in the community that if I told you what block they were on, you wouldn't be able to pick them out. If you hung around for a while and saw the activity, you might go, but then they've been there. We've never had a community incident in any of my crisis acute diversion programs. Never. And there's a reason for that, which I'll get into as a part of this discussion. But one of the reasons is the environment. See, most of residential treatment, when it's done the way I believe is most effective, and there are a lot of opinions on this, I'm not telling you this is gospel, it's just the way I would only do it if I wanted to take the risk we're willing to take. Operate out of an understanding that the most important intervention with an individual coming in an acute crisis is to find a way to emphasize the familiar and de-emphasize the dissonant. You got people who are already inside their own thinking process at the peak of dissonance. And we put them in environments that have no familiarity, so that the environments add to the dissonance, and then the behavior starts, and then we respond to the behavior. Our bet was, and a lot of these things are counterintuitive, but they work, and someday it's gonna be intuitive to provide our most acute services an environment where the individual gets to act in a familiar role as often as possible. And that it's that sense of accomplishment, that sense of being able to, while you're having auditory hallucinations, prepare a meal. They aren't mutually exclusive. That if you have support and help, that if you wake up at 2 in the morning, you don't have a overnight graveyard shift. You have a counselor sitting there who you can go talk to. This idea that it's an intentional community of social, relational development. One of the things that I think you probably all know about the people that we've served in our programs. We do a survey like everybody does. And one of the things we've asked for years, and I remember this going back even to the 70s, is we would ask the people coming into services, what do you see as the precipitant event in this latest crisis or the latest problem? There's all kinds of things. The number 1 mentioned option was loneliness. And I had a clinical consultant in those days who's a brilliant guy who was a neuropsychologist, but was really interested in the social breadth of looking at this phenomenon from other than just technology. And he would say to my staff when he was doing trainings at Progress, he'd say, we don't know what causes the phenomenon of mental illness. It might be brain disease for some people, but what we do know is what we're treating, and we're treating alienation. And that's the common experience of most of our clients. Over time, it's definitely their experience. They've lost context as their mental illness has not abated, they've not gotten services they may need to move forward, or they lose their family They drive their family out of support. They lose their friends who went on to college and things, and they're left in this netherworld of severe mental illness. And pretty soon their only relationships are with the treatment system they're in. And if you're treating loneliness and alienation, you need an environment that counters loneliness, even artificially. I know, and the clients know, they're moving into La Posada or Avenues or Schrader House or George Street, any of our crisis houses. I know they know it's artificial, but that's no reason not to try and replicate a way of communicating that is going to start to lead toward healing. And so the house represents that. It represents 1,000 things that can happen that create chaos in your program. From the doorbell ringing to the toilets clogging up. We don't have janitors who come in and clean up the toilets. That's the job of the staff with the clients there, so they can learn when that happens in your dingy apartment, because that's all we have to offer you when you leave. Here's how you do it. From sitting around at night talking about their lives, telling their story, listening to them. And you don't do that artificially. You do that in an environment that allows it to happen. I used to say to the staff, when an individual comes into your program, they should be able to sit in your living room alone and already feel safer, already feel a certain weight off their shoulders. And that takes work to make that living room feel that way. Then when you come in to add support, it's additive. It's not working against the environment you're operating in. So many of our environments, the staff themselves have to dig through the rubble of protocol and sight lines and locked doors and knives locked up, and just to make contact. I'd be weary too at the end of a working day if I had to work that hard to make contact with a client who's digging from their side of the cave in, trying to make a connection. So the house is critical. And I said to the county, we got to do this in a residence. It's going to have 10 ways for a client to leave. I don't care. Our goal is that they want to stay. We'll put all of our emphasis in them wanting to stay instead of looking for ways to get out. And we bet on that. It's worked incredibly well. It's a risk, but it also has an enormous grounding in interpersonal relations. Second thing was we needed staff that weren't traditional in any way, and I had to fight with the county for this. I don't want any licensed people except one psychiatrist who's working with us, who was an advocate for these programs. I trusted him. We will hire some with credentials if they prove in the interview that it works. We'll hire high school dropouts who know the Mission District well, who have credibility, who are recognized in that community. We want free rein on who we hire. And they gave me that latitude. We had to fight for it, but we got it. Again, because they said, hell, it'll blow up and then fields will be proved wrong and we'll be able to go back. And when I see crisis programs today that for whatever reasons, the system puts it down on them, they just replicate a staffing model of a hospital. They assign certain tasks to people who they think do them better. I'm saying you're losing, it's like having a new heater in your house where you have no ducts they're losing heat constantly, putting out all this energy, and it's not having an impact. So I got to tell you, the first day I hired the staff, but the first day I went to La Posada, in the week we opened the program, and I looked around and I said, oh, now I've done it. I mean, I did not, even I felt like, oh, I got to have more like mental health people in this room. But for those salaries, weren't going to get it, right? So we were all safe. Turned out to be the best thing we ever did. And now my thinking on that idea has gotten more complex, because basically the point is, in a crisis program, ours are 2-week programs, you can't waste time connecting. So when a client gets up in the morning from their first night, they need to see somebody soon that they're willing maybe to talk to. They look like them, they talk like them, they may even know them from the community. Whatever it is, we can't afford to wait for trust to build. And so we needed, on a practical level, a staff that was not homogenous, that was as diverse as the community we were serving, and we weren't going to get that out of just a credentialed idea, which comes out of the risk-averse obsession of our mental health system. And by the way, I might add, my nonprofit community. We could do a whole session on how pissed off I am about my colleagues who don't take risks either. Because counties aren't going to run these programs that effectively. They need to have the freedom to job out the risk. But if I don't have community programs that are willing to take it on, then we have a problem. We're going to get there. That's why I love this effort that Travis and TPD have put together. So we hired from all over. And lo and behold, some of them turned out to be the best acute workers I've ever seen. Some of them washed out. But the fact still was that we had that going for us where clients were willing to talk with us right away. And we resisted. We wrote Medi-Cal regs that I was involved in that institutionalized being able to staff that way through the rehab option in California. My sector and I particularly got aggressive about setting the regs so that when the rehab option came down, our regs were the ones that were being used to determine all levels of residential treatment. I could do a whole thing on politics, which is what I think we also spend too little time understanding and engaging in. And then we wonder why we close, why programs close, why things are so frustrating in your individual programs around the overlay. Third thing was, and this was new back then, now it's in every brochure you're ever going to see. Doesn't mean people really believe in it, but it's been one of the things people have adapted, which is the client is the central decision maker in the treatment, planning and implementation. Practical thing, not a philosophical thing. If you're going to get something done, and half of you doing the work doesn't believe what you're working on is worth anything to them, they're not going to do their half of the work. So, incrementally, our job is to introduce ideas in a client's mind about what they might want to do. We all know who work with psych. We've had dually diagnosed, it used to be called now co-occurring disorders, since the 80s in San Francisco. We had to get rid of that distinction a long time ago. It's a total thing. But you all know from substance abuse treatment, you go to somebody maybe in your own personal lives who's addicted, or going to them and saying, you know, your problem, Bill, is you're an alcoholic. And they say, whoa, I'm going to get better tomorrow. Thank you, I didn't know that. So this idea, you know, that we were going to, even if it's best for them, you know, you need to stop using heroin. That's a good idea for somebody. They're heading down a path of destruction. But telling them that, it doesn't even get you anywhere. So the idea behind this is that you sincerely bring the client, him or herself, into determining what their treatment plan is going to look like and evaluating whether it's going to work. And it may be frustratingly incremental and small at some points, but that's the work you do. The client comes back 2 or 3 times to your crisis program and you expand the discussion. That's the patience you need to have. One of the things Lauren Mosier taught me he said there used to be a word, attending physician, and he would use that word literally. Listen and wait. Attend. Don't do on to somebody because you're anxious. You want to help them. I mean, it comes from all kinds of motivation. So it takes a lot of patience. So you need when I was interviewing for people to come work in the program, way back in the dark ages, and we used to have a process in La Posada we still follow, but when we get the final 2 candidates for a counselor job, they would come into the living room and do their final interview, and all the clients that happened to be in the house that day were invited to the interview. And everybody would be sitting around talking. And one of the interesting things I learned about candidates for these jobs is there were people who would put furniture between themselves and the clients. Literally, they sit with protection. And there were people who would walk into the room and sit right down next to the person who may have been talking out loud about something other than this interview. And you start to realize that doing this kind of work in an environment like ours requires a certain kind of way of thinking. It's not better than anyone else, but it's required to do our work. You have to be comfortable around people who are behaving in a way that might scare other people. Because empathy and understanding is the gateway into discussion. And they're out there, but they aren't coming out of graduate school necessarily. They're not coming out of the credentialing program. They're not even coming out of flight school. They're people who may want to express an interest in working with people who need support, and you can see in them that they're ready right away to break down barriers. And then they're in this toolkit in more detail, because I want to get to one last thing before my time. I woke up in the middle of the night 3 times and wrote notes. My PowerPoint, I tore it up. I confess, I never had it. That sounds good, right? It's the guy who comes out and says, I'm glad to meet with the American people today. And they say, oh, that's this, and then I tear it up and talk to the people. But anyway, I have a lot of ideas that I haven't gotten to, so you can just follow me around. I'll be the one talking to himself. But anyway, the other one is individualized treatment planning. The reason we small is not just the houses have to be human scale. I won't do a program. We do 1 16-bed program in San Francisco for people coming out of skilled nursing facilities. By the way, the most noxious policy in California, and I see it happen in other states, do not let the for-profit skilled nursing industry be your leadership, your behavioral health leadership outlet for getting out of hospital costs. That is a devil's bargain. There are models now that don't need economy of scale to make a profit in that world. So that's just my one little pitch. Look to developing what we've learned over the last 30 years that can replace that. And one of the things I'm proudest of that we've done is alternatives to those skilled nursing settings. California sold out to that industry in the 80s. And some people have come into the community system of care and their brochures look just like mine. Now, they know the rhetoric, but I'm not so sure it's happening. So anyway, it's individualized treatment can only happen if you got 10, 12 people in your program. You don't have to have one rule for everybody. I had a situation in one of my houses. I got a call from a client who got my name and number, called me up a few years ago. Said, I need to tell you I'm really pissed off at your program. And I said, well, what's the problem? He said, well, I'm about ready to leave Progress House. And I got a volunteer job that's in the field I want to work in with animals. And the night they want me is the same night as the house meeting. I said, yeah, what's the problem? He said, well, the program director told me I couldn't do both. I had to come to the house meeting. So I have to give up this job. He said, that doesn't make sense. And I said, I agree with you. I didn't want to check in. So I called in the program and said, what are you doing? And the answer to me was, well, if I let him get out of the meeting, all the others are going to want to get out. So I said, you know, Ken, you know what your problem is here? He said, no. He said, you have one really lousy meeting. You know? If everybody wants to get out of it, you think you might think of a different way to do it. What you want is this client calling, saying, can't we move it to another day so I can be involved? And you know, it's that whole thing of that's the way we've always done it. That will infect any program without, you know, diligence and oversight. So, and the last one, which I won't go into great detail because I've been referring to it all along, a willingness to take risks. This program is counterintuitive in every way. It'll be counterintuitive to your funders, counterintuitive to your boards of directors, but you know, when I did La Posada, there wasn't any research on this. Now there's a lot of it, and we owe it to our sector to bring to bear the research, particularly the research that supports programs like Community Research Foundation, like McAuliffe House in Maryland, like even the Soteria Project, because they are at the front end of preventing hospitalization. I never want to turn into a step-down facility because I'm conceding that door to the inpatient people. And believe me, if you don't offer an alternative, they will see everyone needing hospitalization. Sometimes altruistically and for all the right reasons. You know, if the only tool you've got to hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And we've got to present them with a broader toolbox of what can be possible and be aggressive about it. And then the last thing I want to say, I want to talk a little bit about Lauren. I got 4 minutes. 2 last things. This is a Lauren Mosher story. You know, he ended his career here in San Diego as the mental health director. The idea that a guy that radical would become the director of behavioral, they won't call it behavioral yet, mental health services, and that he would take on a job like running a county that needed to change in many ways. was an inspiration to me. Because I tell my staff all the time, Progress Foundation is like a transplanted organ. The body we're operating within, the public mental health system, constantly is trying to reject us. They don't want us there, but we keep working for them, so they keep replicating us. Nobody in San Francisco has ever heard what I just said this morning to you guys. No one cares. So are you going to do the job? Will you take these people? Will they come out? Will the hospital say you're doing it? Yes, okay, fine. And no one's curious as to how we're able to do it. So I guess that's the third element of most county systems, or most government. They're not curious. I don't mean individuals. We've survived on the good thinking and the support of individuals within those bureaucracies. But the greater whole is less than the sum of the parts. It's the opposite of synergy. So I was, Lauren, out of his sort of bizarre and sense of humor, invited me in the early 80s to come speak to the New York Psychiatric Association. And I knew he was setting me up, but I thought, well, this will be fun. I love New York, so we went to New York. So I did this presentation there, and I covered the principles of social rehab, how we work, many of the things you've heard this morning. A lot more about the interaction inside the program and as an intentional community. And then I ended and I took questions, and the first guy came to the microphone. He said, well, this is all really interesting, Mr. Fields, but I'm kind of wondering, where's the treatment? And I thought, you know, there, in the same building there was a bedding and a linens conference of the association. I thought, now I'd have been better received over there by at least talking about people who get their own bed and they can like. So I said, you know, okay, perverse time. So I said, okay, you're right. I haven't, I guess, covered your concerns about treatment. So let me tell you what the foundation principle of treatment in Progress Foundation is. So it's the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And there was hissing in the room. Like, what? We're doing it. But in some way, that's what I ask my staff to do. I ask my staff every time I do orientations for new staff. I say, here's what I need you to do each day. When you go to work, you open the key of the house and you're going in on a shift. Or you're sitting in a staff meeting, you're talking to your peers and your colleagues. You need to ask yourself, if somebody I loved was suddenly pulled into this public mental health system, with all the fears that go with that and would you want that person you love to be in the program you're working in? And if you can't say yes, you have a lot of work to do to get back to saying, you know, I wouldn't want my loved one in the mental health system, but if they're there, this is where they'll be treated with dignity and respect. And you've got to use that measure all the time, because otherwise your enthusiasm will erode, you'll get burned out. You've got other people who heard this same message. So every once in a while, do a gut check on it. And then the last, this is like go from that to, yeah. But I was reading the handbook and I was reading about things. Let me say that when we develop a movement around crisis residential of all stripes, but I'm a proselytizer for that's where the money is. The way to fund these things is you take money from the hospital and you provide an alternative that's better, cheaper, and that the consumers like better. And we fight for those things. Otherwise, we'll always be patronized by the institutional system if we're not challenging their assumptions in all our jurisdictions. Without transitional residential treatment in your, whatever you call a continuum of care, it's not going to work. And that's when I get fearful about crisis programs that lead right out into substandard systems of care. Can you imagine somebody who has just an addiction going into a program for 2 weeks and then 3 months and then being better, or 2 weeks and then being better? Who has ever had their addiction cured in an inpatient stay of 8 days? Who has ever had it seriously addressed in one of my crisis residential programs for 2 weeks? You set a stage in these programs for ongoing involvement in recovery. And if you don't have a fully staffed 90-day to 6-month transitional set of programs to refer to, we're just a social model revolving door. And I read so much in the handbook about these systems. There are people, it's kind of like going from a luxury hotel in Beirut, you know, the crisis residential program, those people all running around helping you, and then you walk out the door and you're in the destruction of a system of care that doesn't have adequate supports. And I've now said to any county that's called me about doing crisis residential, because it's a hot, sexy issue in California right now, I asked the county, do you have any real transitional residential treatment programs? What's that? Housing? I said, no. Medi-Cal funded, 90-day programs where they're intensely staffed, not as much as crisis, where the goal is to continue rehabilitation and recovery principles so that they get a shot at moving on. And then, what's your supported living system look like to link with that? So I want to leave an advocacy note for all of us in the crisis residential. We need to add to our message, especially if we're going to start talking about outcomes. I don't want to be judged on 2 weeks of La Posada for somebody goes into a system where there's nothing for them. I'm willing to be judged at Progress Foundation on crisis residential that's backed up with a 90-day transitional program with the same philosophy of treatment and the same thing. Those, if we don't do that, community mental health will never start to realize what it could have been. In a way, what we're doing now is what we didn't do in 1970, 71, 75. If we're starting to imagine through programs like you all run, what a community mental health center service system would have looked like that owned its own distinctness, owned its own outcome goals, owned its own way of thinking about and working with the people we serve. And we're just starting that mission now. And so go out and continue to do your work. I appreciate you listening.
For me, I call that Church on Thursday.
Sing!
Yeah, right. Thank you, Steve. Such a moving talk and such great information that I really think everyone needs to hear. Historical perspectives, practicality, how to really make this work. Just a couple announcements before we go to break. First of all, lunch is happening at 12 o'clock, which is right after the next session, and that's right next door in a room that has a name that I don't have in front of me. But just go one door over, right? The tour, for those of you that signed up for the tour or have talked to Dan, the tour, we're going to meet at 4:30, right by where you are registered. So the kind of like that driveway there, that's where the bus is going to be. So make sure you're there by 4:30. I don't know you all well enough to be like, oh, we got to wait for so and so. Like, just be there. Yeah, Dan.
So the bus is actually going to be where it says in the schedule.
Oh, we're gonna.
The Royal Palm Tower.
Royal Palm.
Back here.
We're gonna do what we said we're gonna do. Okay. We'll be congruent. That's fine. Ignore me. Just listen to Dan. What your program says is where we're going. Reminder, Laura mentioned the interactive map. We've got that over during lunch. Feel free to just play around with it. We'd love your feedback. Also, if you represent a program that was not involved in our toolkit development, we have a brief taxonomy form that just asks for information about the program, how many beds, like what the length of stay is. As we try to map this crisis genome, we'd love your feedback so that we can gather that information on all the programs. If you didn't see it on the screen, the Wi-Fi password is recovery, and it's on the Crisis ResCon network. And speaking of that, please join us in the conversation on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and use that hashtag CrisisResCon. I would love to hear your experiences and kind of what's sticking out to you. So we will go ahead and take a break, and we'll be back in here at 11 o'clock. Thank you.